The Wyoming Territory stretched endless under the 1885 autumn sky when Thomas Brennan first saw the smoke rising from the hidden canyon. 3 years had passed since consumption claimed his 8-year-old daughter Sarah, 3 years of carrying grief like stones in his saddlebags. He'd taken to riding the remote trails, seeking solitude that might ease the constant ache of loss. What he found instead was an Apache woman named Aiyana tending a small fire, and beside her, a child of perhaps 5 years with golden hair and startling blue eyes. The woman looked up as Thomas approached, her weathered face calm despite his unexpected presence. "She has your daughter's eyes," Aiyana said simply, as if she'd been expecting him. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. How could this stranger know about Sarah? How could this abandoned child possess the same unusual violet blue eyes that had been Sarah's most distinctive feature? But if this child isn't his daughter, then who is she, and why does she seem to know him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Brennan had not always been a man who rode alone through wilderness, seeking answers from empty horizons. 3 years ago, he owned the most prosperous cattle ranch in Carbon County, with 2,000 head of prime beef and a reputation for fair dealing that stretched from Cheyenne to Denver. His wife, Martha, had made their home a place where neighbors gathered for Sunday dinners, where her laughter filled rooms that now echoed with nothing but memory. The leather-bound journal tucked in his saddlebags told a different story than the confident rancher he'd once been. Page after page recorded the slow dissolution of everything he'd built, written in his careful script during long nights when sleep brought only dreams of small hands reaching for him in darkness. Sarah took sick on a Tuesday, read one entry dated 2 months after her funeral. "Martha blames me for not calling the doctor sooner. Says I was too concerned with the cattle prices to notice our daughter burning with fever. Maybe she's right. Maybe I failed them both when it mattered most." The consumption had taken Sarah quickly, as it often did with children. One week she was helping him sort buttons from her mother's sewing box, her violet blue eyes bright with concentration as she arranged them by color. The next week she lay still in their bedroom, those same eyes closed forever, her small body finally at peace after days of racking coughs that echoed through their house like accusations. Martha left 6 months later, unable to bear the sight of Sarah's empty room or Thomas's increasingly distant attempts at normal conversation. "I can't grieve with a man who won't admit he's broken," she'd told him the morning she loaded her belongings into the wagon. "Find me when you're ready to be human again." But Thomas had discovered that being human hurt too much. Better to sell the cattle, lease the land, and disappear into territory where no one expected him to recover or move forward or accept God's will with Christian resignation. Out here riding paths that led nowhere particular, he could carry his guilt without witnesses to his failure at healing. The journal documented his transformation from successful rancher to drifter. Early entries focused on practical matters, which routes offered water, which trading posts welcomed solitary travelers, which areas harbored hostile tribes or dangerous wildlife. Gradually, the writing shifted toward something resembling prayer, though Thomas no longer believed God listened to men who'd failed to protect their children. "Rode past the Henderson place today," he'd written last month. "Saw their youngest playing in the yard, maybe 6 years old. Had to keep riding before they noticed me watching. Don't trust myself around children anymore. What if I can't protect them either?" The silver locket containing Sarah's daguerreotype portrait had worn smooth from his thumb, tracing its surface during long evenings around campfires. Inside, her serious expression gazed back at him with those remarkable eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. Even as a baby, strangers had commented on their unusual color, violet blue like mountain wildflowers or sunset skies over snow-covered peaks. Thomas had ridden into this particular canyon, following smoke that might indicate human presence, though he rarely sought company anymore. Solitude had become his preferred companion, demanding nothing but his ability to keep moving forward without destination or purpose. Yet something about this smoke seemed different, more inviting than threatening, as if calling him toward answers he'd stopped expecting to find. The Apache woman showed no surprise at his approach, as if she'd been waiting. Her weathered hands continued their work preparing what appeared to be medicinal herbs, movements careful and practiced. The child beside her looked up from play with a wooden doll, her golden hair catching firelight in ways that made Thomas's chest tighten with familiar pain. Then the woman spoke those impossible words about his daughter's eyes, and Thomas felt the careful walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack. How could this stranger know about Sarah? How could this abandoned child possess the same remarkable gaze that had made his daughter unforgettable to everyone who met her? His horse shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing his emotional turmoil. The journal in his saddlebag seemed to grow heavier, filled as it was with 3 years of carefully recorded grief and self-blame. Perhaps it was time to write a different kind of entry, one that acknowledged the possibility of mysteries beyond his understanding or control. Aiyana had learned to read the wind long before she understood that white men called such knowledge superstition. The sacred medicine bundle at her side contained 43 years of accumulated wisdom, dried sage for cleansing negative spirits, bare root for healing deep wounds of the body, sweet grass for prayers that needed to travel far distances, and eagle down for matters requiring spiritual strength. She was no longer welcome among her own people, though the exile had been her choice, rather than theirs. The Apache respected her medicine skills too much to cast her out, but they could not accept her continued aid to white settlers who trespassed on tribal lands. 3 years ago, when cavalry soldiers pursued a wounded missionary into Apache territory, Aiyana had hidden him in her lodge until his injuries healed. "You choose their lives over ours," her brother had accused, his face marked with the disappointment that hurt worse than anger. "How many of our children must die for their expansion before you understand they see us as obstacles, not neighbors?" Aiyana understood his words carried truth, but her medicine spirit demanded she heal whoever required aid, regardless of skin color or tribal allegiance. The white missionary had spoken of his God's love extending to all people, an idea that resonated with her understanding of the Great Spirit's universal presence. When the tribal council voted to move deeper into the mountains, away from increasing white settlement, Aiyana chose to remain in this hidden canyon, where she could practice her calling without bringing shame to her people. The canyon itself possessed healing properties that exceeded her herb knowledge. Water from the spring that fed the stream carried unusual minerals that accelerated bone mending and reduced fever symptoms. Plants grew larger here, their medicinal properties concentrated in ways she'd never observed elsewhere. Even animals seemed to understand this place offered sanctuary. Wounded deer would emerge from the forest to drink from her spring before disappearing back into the wilderness. 3 months ago, following disturbing dreams about a lost child calling for help, Aiyana had found the little girl nearly dead from exposure beside the stream. The child's golden hair was matted with mud and blood, her small body covered with scratches from thorns and rocks. Most concerning were the emotional wounds that ran deeper than physical injuries. The girl hadn't spoken a word since Aiyana carried her back to the fire. She'd named the child Luna for the full moon that shone the night of her rescue, though the girl showed no recognition of any name. Luna ate when food was offered, slept when darkness fell, but remained locked inside herself, like a seed waiting for proper conditions to sprout. Aiyana had seen such trauma before in children who'd witnessed violence beyond their understanding. The wooden doll Luna clutched constantly appeared hand-carved by someone with more love than skill. Its crude features and simple dress suggested a parent's gift rather than store-bought toy. Aiyana suspected the doll was Luna's only connection to her life before tragedy struck, though attempts to encourage memory through gentle questions had yielded no results. Working with traumatized children required patience that measured progress in weeks rather than days. Aiyana had learned to watch for subtle signs of healing, the way Luna's shoulders relaxed when hearing certain songs, how she responded to specific colors or textures, the gradual return of curiosity about her surroundings. Yesterday, for the first time, Luna had smiled while watching butterflies dance around the wildflowers. The medicine bundle also contained items that connected Aiyana to visions she couldn't fully understand. Eagle feathers arranged in specific patterns sometimes revealed glimpses of future events, though interpreting such images required wisdom that came only through experience. For weeks her dreams had featured a sad man riding toward their canyon, someone carrying grief so heavy it bent his shoulders like physical weight. When the rider appeared on the canyon rim this morning, Aiyana recognized him immediately from her visions. His pain radiated outward like heat from fire, the kind of soul wound that could only come from losing a child. She'd seen that same hollow expression in her own reflection after losing her infant son to fever 15 years ago. But something else accompanied this stranger, something that made Luna look up from her doll with the first spark of interest she'd shown since her rescue. The child's violet blue eyes, so unusual among her people or whites, seemed to focus on the approaching rider with recognition that transcended memory. Aiyana spoke the words her spirit guide had whispered during last night's dream ceremony, knowing they would unlock mysteries that might heal them all. Thomas dismounted slowly, his hands shaking as he secured his horse's reins to a sturdy pine. The wooden doll clutched in the child's arms drew his attention with magnetic force, crude features carved with obvious love, dressed in a simple blue fabric that matched the child's torn dress. Something about the doll's innocent expression reminded him painfully of Sarah's favorite possession, a porcelain-faced companion she'd named Rebecca. "You speak English," Thomas observed, surprised by the Apache woman's clear pronunciation and careful grammar. "Missionaries taught me when I was young," Aiyana replied, continuing to sort dried herbs into small leather pouches. "Before I understood that learning their language meant choosing between two worlds that could not coexist." The child Luna, Aiyana had called her, watched Thomas with those extraordinary eyes that seemed to look straight through his soul. No fear showed in her expression, only curiosity seemed to look straight through his soul. No fear showed in her expression, only curiosity mixed with something that resembled recognition. When Thomas knelt to her level, she tilted her head, exactly the way Sarah used to, when concentrating on adult conversations. She didn't quite understand. "How long has she been with you?" Thomas asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Demetria, Thomas asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. 3 months. I found her beside the stream, nearly dead from cold and hunger. She has not spoken since that night, though she understands everything we say. Thomas studied Luna's face, noting details that made his chest tighten with impossible hope. The shape of her nose, the way her eyebrows arched when she concentrated, the delicate structure of her hands as she adjusted her doll's position. Everything seemed familiar in ways that defied rational explanation. "When you said she has my daughter's eyes," Thomas began carefully. "What did you mean?" Aiyana set down her herbs and looked directly at him, her dark gaze holding depths of understanding that seemed ancient beyond her years. "I meant that the Great Spirit sometimes gives children eyes that can see what adults have forgotten. Your daughter possessed such sight, did she not?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Sarah had indeed shown unusual perception, often knowing things she shouldn't have been able to understand. She'd predicted their neighbor's horse would go lame 2 days before it happened, had known when winter storms were coming before clouds appeared on the horizon, had somehow sensed when adults were lying, even when their deception seemed perfect. Sarah was special, Thomas admitted quietly. She saw things differently than other children. Luna suddenly stood and walked toward Thomas, her movements deliberate and purposeful. She stopped directly in front of him and extended the wooden doll, offering it with the same serious expression Sarah had worn when sharing her most precious possessions. Thomas accepted the doll with trembling hands, noting its surprising weight and the careful attention someone had paid to details like tiny buttons carved from wood and hair made from real human strands, golden like Luna's own locks. The craftsmanship spoke of hours spent creating something meant to last, to comfort, to represent love in tangible form. Her parents made this, Aiyana said softly. I found it clutched in her hands when I discovered her. It is the only connection she has to her life before. What happened to them? Violence. The kind that leaves no survivors, except those small enough to hide or run fast enough to escape notice. Aiyana's voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed too much tragedy. She has not spoken of it, but her dreams tell the story. Her voice cannot. Thomas held the doll carefully, aware that he held Luna's most precious possession, and perhaps her only link to identity beyond the name Aiyana had given her. The child watched his face intently, as if evaluating whether he understood the significance of her gesture. Why did you give this to me? Thomas asked Luna directly, though he didn't expect an answer. Luna moved closer and placed her small hand on his knee, her touch gentle but somehow commanding attention. For a moment, Thomas felt the same sense of being truly seen that he'd experienced with Sarah, the feeling that this child understood things about him that he'd never spoken aloud. She knows you understand loss, Aiyana explained. Children who have experienced great pain recognize it in others. Perhaps she senses that you can protect what matters most. The afternoon sun shifted lower, casting longer shadows across the canyon. Thomas realized he faced a decision that would define the remainder of his life. Walk away from this impossible situation, or stay long enough to understand what forces had brought him to this hidden place, at exactly the moment when his presence might matter most. As evening settled over the canyon, Thomas agreed to Aiyana's invitation to share their fire for the night. The decision felt both natural and terrifying, like stepping toward a cliff edge while hoping for solid ground beyond. He unsaddled his horse and set up his bedroll at a respectful distance, though Luna seemed determined to eliminate any space between them. The child had returned to playing with her doll, but her movements now included Thomas in elaborate scenarios only she understood. She would bring the doll to him for imaginary conversations, then carry it to Aiyana for what appeared to be medical consultations, creating a triangle of interaction that felt surprisingly familial. What unsettled Thomas most were Luna's unconscious mannerisms that perfectly mirrored Sarah's childhood habits. She hummed tunelessly while playing, the same three-note melody Sarah had always hummed during concentration. When Aiyana served simple stew from her cooking pot, Luna ate with her left hand while keeping her right protectively around her doll, exactly as Sarah had done with her porcelain Rebecca. Most disturbing was the way Luna organized small objects she found around the camp. She arranged pebbles, dried leaves and bits of bark in precise patterns that Sarah had favored, geometric designs that seemed random but followed internal logic only the child understood. Thomas had watched Sarah create identical arrangements for hours, her young mind finding order in chaos through careful placement of everyday items. She does this often, Aiyana observed, noticing Thomas's intense attention to Luna's activities. Always the same patterns, as if following instructions only she can hear. Thomas pulled Sarah's blue silk hair ribbon from his shirt pocket, a talisman he'd carried since her funeral. The ribbon had been his gift for her 7th birthday, chosen because its color matched her eyes. He'd planned to save it as a memento of happier times, but seeing it now made his breath catch in his throat. Luna wore an identical ribbon in her golden hair. The fabric was the same shade, the same width, even the same subtle pattern of tiny flowers woven into the silk. Thomas stared at the impossibility before him, his rational mind struggling to explain what his eyes clearly confirmed. 2 identical ribbons, one carried by a grieving father across hundreds of miles of wilderness, the other worn by a mysterious child with no known past. Where did she get that ribbon? Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. Aiyana followed his gaze to Luna's hair ornament,
then to the matching fabric in his trembling fingers. Her expression remained calm, as if such coincidences occurred regularly in her experience. She wore it when I found her. I assumed her mother had tied it before. Aiyana paused delicately, unwilling to speak of violence in the child's presence. Thomas approached Luna slowly, kneeling beside her pebble arrangements. She looked up at him with those remarkable violet blue eyes, her expression expectant, as if she'd been waiting for this moment of recognition. "May I see your ribbon?" Thomas asked gently. Luna reached up and carefully untied the silk from her hair, offering it to Thomas with the same solemnity she'd shown when sharing her doll. The ribbon felt exactly like Sarah's, down to the slightly rough texture, where the edges had been hand-finished, rather than machine-cut. Thomas held both ribbons side by side in the firelight, unable to deny their identical nature. Two ribbons that should have been unique, connecting two little girls who should never have had any relationship, brought together in a hidden canyon where an Apache medicine woman spoke of spiritual mysteries with matter-of-fact acceptance. "This is impossible," Thomas whispered. "Many things seem impossible until we understand their purpose," Aiyana replied. "The spirits sometimes work in ways that challenge our limited understanding of how the world functions." Luna resumed her play, but now she included Thomas's ribbon in her arrangements, weaving both pieces of silk through her careful patterns, as if they had always belonged together. Her humming continued, the three-note melody Sarah had loved, filling the evening air with sounds that made Thomas's heart ache with wickedness and hope in equal measure. The fire crackled softly as darkness deepened around their small circle of light.
Thomas found himself caught between the desire to flee from mysteries he couldn't comprehend and the growing certainty that running away would mean abandoning something precious beyond measure. Above them, stars emerged one by one in the clear mountain sky, silent witnesses to the impossible convergence of grief and hope, loss and discovery, past sorrow and potential future joy that flickered in the canyon like their small but persistent fire. Dawn broke with unusual clarity, as if the night had washed the air clean of doubt and hesitation. Thomas woke to find Luna sitting beside his bedroll, her wooden doll positioned carefully between them, like a bridge connecting two worlds. She had braided both silk ribbons into her hair, creating a crown of blue that caught the early light. Aiyana was already awake, preparing what appeared to be traveling supplies. Her movements held the efficiency of someone who had made such preparations many times, but also the deliberation of someone who understood that this journey would be different from any she'd undertaken before. "We need to find where she came from," Thomas said, the decision surprising him with its certainty. "Someone must be looking for her, wondering what happened, or someone may prefer that she never be found." Aiyana replied quietly, her hands continuing to pack dried food and medicinal herbs. "Children do not survive alone in the wilderness unless they are fleeing something worse than death." The possibility had occurred to Thomas during the sleepless hours before dawn, but he'd pushed it aside in favor of more comforting explanations. Now, watching Luna's careful attention to every sound from beyond their canyon, he recognized signs of deep weariness that spoke of experiences no child should endure. "Then we find the truth," Thomas said. "Whatever it is." Aiyana produced a torn photograph from her medicine bundle, its edges charred and one corner completely missing. The image showed a woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, her arm around empty space where another person had been standing. Luna's golden hair and blue eyes were clearly inherited from whoever had been torn away from the picture. "This was hidden in her dress when I found her," Aiyana explained. "The other half was missing, burned away before she escaped whatever destroyed her family." Thomas studied the remaining portion, noting the woman's simple dress and the background that suggested a modest homestead rather than wealthy circumstances. The photographer's mark in the corner indicated the picture had been taken in Silver Creek, a settlement 3 days' ride north through dangerous territory. "Silver Creek," Thomas mused. "I've heard of it. Growing town, lots of new families moving in from back east. Also lots of tension between settlers and local tribes," Aiyana added. the kind of place where misunderstandings turn violent quickly. Luna approached them carrying her doll, but now she also held a small piece of charcoal from their fire. With careful strokes, she began drawing on a flat stone, her young hands creating images that made Thomas's blood run cold. Houses burning, people running, men on horseback with weapons, and in the center of it all, a small figure hiding beneath what appeared to be a wagon, clutching a wooden doll while chaos erupted around her. The drawing was crude, but unmistakably clear in its narrative. Luna had witnessed massacre, had somehow survived when others perished, had fled into wilderness carrying nothing but her most precious possession, and the traumatic memories that haunted her dreams. "We need to take her somewhere safe," Thomas said, studying the child's artwork with growing determination. "Find proper authorities, get her placed with a good family." But even as he spoke the words, Thomas felt their inadequacy. Luna had chosen to trust him, to share her most precious possessions, to include him in her careful rituals of survival. The thought of delivering her to strangers, no matter how well-intentioned, felt like betrayal of the fragile bond they'd formed. Aiyana watched his internal struggle with knowing eyes. "The heart wants to protect what it recognizes as precious," she observed. "But protection sometimes requires difficult choices." "What do you mean?" "I mean that taking her to Silver Creek might expose her to whoever wanted her family dead in the first place, and taking her to authorities might separate her from the only stability she's known since her rescue." The dilemma crystallized with painful clarity. Luna needed safety, identity, and proper care, but she also needed continuity, understanding, and people who could see past her trauma to the remarkable spirit that survived beneath. Thomas looked at Luna, who was adding details to her drawing with the concentrated attention Sarah had always shown during art projects. The similarity in their focus, their careful attention to getting important details exactly right, struck him with fresh impact. "What if we traveled together?" he heard himself suggesting. "Find out what happened, make sure she's safe, but keep her with people she trusts while we sort out the truth." Aiyana smiled, the first time Thomas had seen her expression shift from patient wisdom to something approaching approval. "Now you begin to understand what the spirits intended when they brought you to our canyon," she said. The journey to Silver Creek led through territory that tested both resolve and endurance. Thomas rode his familiar sorrel gelding, while Aiyana traveled on foot with the tireless pace of someone who had learned to read the land's moods through the soles of her moccasins. Luna rode double with Thomas, her small body fitting naturally against his chest as if she belonged there. The first day passed through relatively safe terrain, following game trails that avoided main roads where their unusual traveling party might attract unwanted attention. Thomas had noticed suspicious glances in frontier towns when he'd traveled alone. Appearing with an Apache woman and mysterious child would certainly provoke questions he wasn't prepared to answer. By afternoon, they encountered evidence of recent conflict. Broken arrows scattered near a burned-out way station told stories of violence that made Thomas's hand drift instinctively toward his rifle. Aiyana examined the scene with professional detachment, reading signs that revealed tactical information about who had fought whom and why. Cavalry patrol, she determined, pointing to distinctive horseshoe marks in dried mud. They were pursuing someone toward the mountains, probably a small group fleeing on foot. Apache, could be, or settlers accused of trading with tribes. These days, anyone who refuses to choose sides becomes suspect to both. Luna had grown increasingly restless as they traveled, her attention focused on landmarks that seemed to trigger fragmentary memories. When they crested a particular ridge, she pointed urgently toward a distant valley, her first voluntary communication since joining their journey. Thomas followed her gesture and saw smoke rising from what appeared to be a large settlement. Silver Creek spread across the valley floor like a promise of civilization, complete with church steeple, main street, and the geometric patterns of planned development that characterized successful frontier towns. But something else caught his attention. A brass military button lay half buried near their resting spot, its eagle emblem tarnished but clearly visible. The button was regulation Army issue, but it showed scratches and damage that suggested violent removal from its original uniform. "This doesn't belong here," Thomas observed, cleaning dirt from the button's surface. "Nearest military post is 50 miles south." Aiyana examined the button with growing concern. "Unless soldiers have been operating in this area without authorization, the kind of missions that don't appear in official reports." Luna's reaction to the button was immediate and terrifying. She pressed herself against Thomas's chest, her small body shaking with tremors that spoke of recognition and remembered fear. The wooden doll fell from her hands as she clutched desperately at his shirt, seeking protection from memories that threatened to overwhelm her fragile composure. "Easy, little one," Thomas murmured, his arms tightening protectively around her. "You're safe now. Nothing's going to hurt you while I'm here." But Luna's distress continued, her breathing rapid and shallow, as if the simple sight of military insignia had transported her back to whatever nightmare she'd escaped. Aiyana approached slowly, her hands moving in calming gestures while she spoke in Apache, her voice carrying rhythms that seemed designed to soothe traumatized spirits. Gradually, Luna's trembling subsided, though she refused to look at the button again. Thomas tucked it carefully into his saddlebag, understanding that it represented evidence of something important, but not wanting to subject Luna to further distress. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered grove that offered concealment from the main trail. Thomas had grown increasingly uneasy about their exposed position. The closer they came to Silver Creek, the more he sensed they were approaching danger rather than safety. "Tell me about your dreams," Aiyana said to Luna as they shared their simple meal. "Sometimes talking about difficult memories helps them lose their power to frighten us." Luna remained silent, but she began arranging pebbles around their fire in patterns that seemed to represent buildings, people, and movement. Her small hands worked with urgent precision, creating a three-dimensional map of some remembered location. Thomas watched her work, recognizing the same careful attention to detail that Sarah had shown when explaining complicated games or stories. Luna was trying to communicate something important through the only means available to her traumatized mind. When she finished, the pebble arrangement showed a clear narrative: houses in neat rows, people moving peacefully about their business, then larger stones representing horsemen arriving, followed by chaos as the smaller stones scattered in all directions. One tiny pebble remained hidden beneath a larger rock, representing a small survivor who had witnessed everything. "Silver Creek," Aiyana said quietly, understanding Luna's message. "She's trying to warn us about what we'll find there." Thomas studied the child's face in the firelight, seeing determination mixed with fear. Luna knew they needed to continue toward the town, but she also understood the dangers that awaited them there. The Morrison homestead lay 3 miles outside Silver Creek proper, accessible by a wagon road that had once bustled with the optimistic traffic of new settlers. Now the path showed only recent hoofprints from official investigations and scavengers hoping to salvage useful items from the ruins. Thomas dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the systematic destruction that spoke of deliberate rather than random violence. The main house had been reduced to charred timber and blackened stone, but the pattern of burning suggested accelerants had been used to ensure complete destruction. This wasn't the result of Apache raiders seeking supplies or soldiers responding to hostile action. This was execution disguised as frontier conflict. Aiyana moved through the ruins with practiced efficiency, reading signs that revealed the timeline of destruction. Her hands traced scorch marks and examined debris with the analytical attention of someone who had investigated too many such scenes. They were burned out at night, she determined. Multiple fires set simultaneously to prevent escape. Whoever did this wanted no survivors. Luna refused to dismount from Thomas's horse, her small hands gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity.
Her breathing had become shallow and rapid again, the same distressed pattern she'd shown when seeing the military button. But now she pointed with trembling finger toward a collapsed section of what had been the kitchen. Thomas approached the area Luna indicated, stepping carefully through debris that might conceal evidence or dangers. Near what had been the back door, partially hidden beneath fallen roof beams, he found what appeared to be a child's belongings scattered by wind and weather. A small leather boot, its size matching Luna's feet perfectly, lay beside fragments of burned clothing and household items. The boot showed no fire damage, suggesting it had been lost during flight, rather than destroyed in the blaze. Its mate was nowhere to be found, probably carried away during Luna's desperate escape into the wilderness. "This confirms she lived here," Thomas said, holding up the boot for Aiyana to examine. "And this confirms why she ran," Aiyana replied grimly, pointing to bullet holes in the kitchen doorframe. "The shots were fired from inside the house, someone trying to fight their way out, while the building burned around them." The implications settled over Thomas, like cold mountain air. Luna's family hadn't simply been caught in random frontier violence. They'd been targeted for elimination by people who wanted to ensure no witnesses survived. The child's escape represented a failure in someone's carefully planned massacre. Thomas began a systematic search of the ruins, looking for anything that might identify Luna's family or explain why they'd been murdered. Most personal items had been destroyed by fire or scattered by weather, but patient excavation revealed fragments of a family Bible, its leather binding partially protecting interior pages. The surviving text included a family record written in careful feminine handwriting. Elizabeth Morrison, born June 15, 1880, daughter of James and Catherine Morrison. Below that, in the same hand, "God grant her wisdom beyond her years and protection from those who would harm innocents." Elizabeth Morrison. Luna had a real name, a documented identity, parents who had loved her enough to record prayers for her safety. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling around him, like a heavy coat. This child wasn't just a mysterious foundling, but someone's beloved daughter, whose family had died protecting her. "Morrison," Thomas repeated, the name triggering recognition. "I knew a Morrison family back in Colorado. James Morrison wrote me about bringing his family to Wyoming Territory. Said he'd found good farmland near a growing town." The connection crystallized with painful clarity. James Morrison had been Thomas's distant cousin, a relationship maintained through occasional letters, but never personal visits. They'd shared the same grandfather, the same stubborn determination to build something lasting in frontier territory, the same faith that hard work and honest dealing would eventually triumph over chaos and violence. "She's family," Thomas whispered, the revelation hitting him like physical impact. "Luna, Elizabeth. She's my cousin's daughter, my blood." Aiyana watched his face transform as understanding dawned. "The spirits brought you to her, for reasons beyond coincidence," she observed. Family calls to family, even across great distances and through terrible circumstances. Luna finally climbed down from the horse, approaching the ruins with the careful steps of someone returning to a place of nightmares. She walked directly to a specific spot near the kitchen, and began digging with her small hands.
Her wand directly to a specific spot near the kitchen and began digging with her small hands, her movements urgent and purposeful. From beneath a fallen beam, she retrieved the missing boot's mate, clutching it against her chest like a tangible connection to her lost parents. When she looked up at Thomas, her violet blue eyes held recognition that went beyond their recent acquaintance to something deeper and more permanent, the acknowledgement of family bonds that death could not sever. Thomas found the birth certificate tucked inside what remained of an iron strongbox, its edges charred, but the center portion miraculously intact. The official document confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. Elizabeth Morrison, born to James William Morrison and Catherine Rose Morrison, residents of Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory. But more devastating was what else the certificate revealed. James Morrison wasn't just a distant cousin. He was Thomas's first cousin, son of his father's brother, who had moved west 15 years earlier. The family connection ran deeper than casual correspondence. Elizabeth was Thomas's bloodkin, the last surviving member of a branch of his family tree that had been violently severed. "I could have prevented this," Thomas said, his voice hollow with guilt. "If I'd stayed in contact, visited them, been part of their lives instead of wallowing in my own grief." Aiyana knelt beside him in the ruins, her weathered hands gentle as she took the certificate to examine its details. "The past cannot be changed, only honored through present actions. This child survived for reasons the spirits understand, even when we do not." Elizabeth, Thomas found himself unable to think of her as Luna anymore, watched their conversation with those remarkable eyes that seemed to comprehend adult emotions beyond her years. The discovery of her true identity had triggered no celebration or relief, only a deeper sadness that suggested she understood the full weight of being the sole survivor of her family's destruction. The birth certificate also contained information that made Thomas's chest tighten with recognition and disbelief. Under distinguishing characteristics, Catherine Morrison had noted unusual violet-blue eyes, identical to her late Aunt Sarah. Below that, in James's masculine handwriting, Elizabeth shows same perceptive abilities as cousin Sarah, sees things others miss. The revelation struck Thomas like lightning. Sarah and Elizabeth were connected, not just by family blood, but by whatever gift allowed certain children to perceive truths that remained hidden from ordinary sight. His daughter's unusual abilities hadn't been unique but inherited, passed down through Morrison bloodlines like eye color or left-handedness. Sarah had a cousin, Thomas whispered, staring at the document. "A little cousin with the same eyes, the same gift, and I never knew." Elizabeth approached slowly, her small hand touching the certificate with reverence reserved for sacred objects. When she looked up at Thomas, her expression held recognition that transcended their recent acquaintance. She was seeing him not as a stranger who had found her, but as family who had finally come home. For the first time since Aiyana found her, Elizabeth spoke. Her voice was barely audible, roughened by months of silence, but the single word carried weight that transformed everything between them. "Papa." The question wasn't confusion about his identity, but recognition of his proper role in her life. Elizabeth understood that Thomas represented not just safety but belonging, the restoration of family bonds that violence had tried to sever permanently. Thomas knelt to her level, his hands shaking as he reached for her. "I'm your papa's cousin, sweetheart. Your family. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Elizabeth moved into his arms with the trust Sarah had always shown, her small body fitting against his chest as if it belonged there. The wooden doll remained clutched in one hand while her other arm circled his neck, claiming him as surely as he was claiming her. "We need to leave this place," Aiyana said quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon with growing urgency. "Whoever destroyed this family will not appreciate the discovery of a survivor, especially one old enough to remember what happened." Thomas understood the implications immediately. Elizabeth's existence represented a threat to whoever had orchestrated the Morrison family's murder. Her survival meant potential witness testimony, possible identification of killers, and certainly unwanted questions about motives and methods. But accepting responsibility for Elizabeth also meant accepting war with unknown enemies who possessed resources and ruthlessness sufficient to eliminate entire families. Thomas was one man with limited fighting skills, aging reflexes, and no institutional support against opponents who had demonstrated their willingness to kill without hesitation. "They wanted to erase the Morrison family completely," Thomas said, his arms tightening protectively around Elizabeth. "But they failed. She survived, and now she has family again, family that will protect her," Aiyana agreed. "But protection requires more than good intentions. It requires commitment to fight battles you might not win." Thomas looked down at Elizabeth's trusting face, seeing Sarah's features reflected in his cousin's daughter,
understanding that some responsibilities transcended personal safety or rational calculation. Elizabeth needed him to be more than the broken man who had wandered into the canyon, seeking solitude. She needed him to become the protector. Her parents had died, trying to be Dot. The wanted poster appeared nailed to trees and fence posts throughout the territory, like a plague of official lies. Thomas discovered the first one at a trading post 20 miles south of Silver Creek, its bold lettering visible from 50 yards away. The crude illustration showed Aiyana's face with reasonable accuracy, but the description beneath transformed her from medicine woman to dangerous criminal. Wanted, Apache witch known as Aiyana for kidnapping white child and practicing illegal medicine. Reward of $500 for information leading to capture. Child believed held against her will. Contact Jacob Winters, authorized territorial agent. The poster's lies were so blatant, they would have been laughable if not for their deadly implications. Aiyana hadn't kidnapped Elizabeth, she'd saved her from death in the wilderness. The illegal medicine accusation was particularly twisted, considering her healing work had helped more settlers than most territorial doctors. But the $500 reward would attract every bounty hunter, desperate drifter, and greedy settler in the territory. Such money represented more than most families earned in a full year of honest work. Thomas tore down the poster, crumpling it with hands that shook with anger rather than fear. Someone with significant resources and political connections had orchestrated this campaign. Someone who wanted Elizabeth recaptured badly enough to risk public attention that might expose their involvement in the Morrison family massacre. Winters, Thomas muttered, studying the contact name. He'd heard that name before, whispered in saloons and trading posts as someone who took contracts too dangerous or morally questionable for legitimate law enforcement.
Jacob Winters built his reputation on finding people who didn't want to be found, on solving problems that required methods outside legal boundaries. His services commanded premium prices because he delivered results without asking inconvenient questions about client motives or preferred outcomes. The trading post proprietor, a grizzled man named Pete Sullivan, approached with the careful neutrality of someone who survived frontier commerce by avoiding controversial topics. "That poster went up yesterday," Sullivan said quietly. "Fellow who brought it paid extra to make sure it got prominent placement. You see this fellow? Big man, well-dressed, talked like he had education and authority. Traveled with 3 others who looked like hired guns rather than proper lawmen." Thomas felt ice forming in his stomach. Professional killers masquerading as territorial agents, backed by someone wealthy enough to post substantial rewards and influential enough to create official-looking documentation. Elizabeth's survival threatened people with both motivation and means to eliminate witnesses permanently. "They ask about anyone matching these descriptions." Sullivan's expression grew more cautious. "Mister, I run a business that depends on treating all customers fairly, regardless of their circumstances or traveling companions. I don't volunteer information about folks who mind their own business." The diplomatic response told Thomas everything he needed to know. Sullivan had seen them pass through, probably traded with them for supplies, but possessed enough wisdom to avoid involvement in territorial politics that could destroy his livelihood. Thomas purchased ammunition and additional food supplies, paying premium prices without complaint. Sullivan's silence had value that exceeded monetary cost. It might buy them time to reach safety before Winters picked up their trail. But as Thomas prepared to leave, Sullivan spoke again, his voice barely audible. "If I were traveling with companions who attracted such attention, I might consider routes that avoid main roads and settlements. The mountain passes are dangerous this time of year, but they're also less traveled by folks carrying wanted posters." The advice was offered with the careful indirection of someone who wanted to help without accepting responsibility for the consequences. Thomas nodded his understanding and gratitude. As he rode away from the trading post, Thomas spotted movement on a distant ridge that made his blood run cold. 4 riders had positioned themselves to observe the building, their presence professional and patient. They'd been watching, waiting to see who showed interest in the wanted poster, ready to follow anyone matching their quarry's description. Jacob Winters had arrived in the territory with his team of killers, and they were closer than Thomas had imagined possible. Thomas urged his horse toward the concealed camp, where Aiyana and Elizabeth waited, his mind racing through options that seemed to narrow with each passing moment. Running meant living as fugitives with a traumatized child. Fighting meant facing professional killers with superior numbers and resources. But surrender meant delivering Elizabeth to people who had already demonstrated their willingness to murder entire families to protect their secrets. Whatever Elizabeth had witnessed during the massacre, whatever she might remember about her family's killers, someone considered her knowledge dangerous enough to justify extreme measures to prevent her testimony. The game had changed from rescue to survival, and Thomas understood that their enemies possessed every advantage except one. They didn't know that Elizabeth Morrison had found family willing to die protecting her. Thomas's father's compass had guided 3 generations of Brennan men through dangerous territory, its brass surface worn smooth by countless fingers seeking direction in uncertain times. Now it pointed them toward the high mountain passes where autumn snow had already begun to accumulate, treacherous routes that offered concealment at the cost of exposure to elements that killed as efficiently as bullets. The flight from civilization had transformed their small party into something resembling a family unit forged by necessity and mutual dependence. Elizabeth rode with Thomas during daylight hours, her small body warm against his chest as they navigated increasingly difficult terrain. Aiyana maintained her tireless pace on foot, her knowledge of hidden water sources and edible plants keeping them alive as they climbed toward elevations where trees grew sparse and oxygen thinned. Jacob Winters had proven relentless in his pursuit, his tracking skills and local knowledge allowing him to close distances that should have been insurmountable. Twice they'd seen his riders on distant ridges, black dots against the sky that marked their progress with mathematical precision. The bounty hunter seemed to anticipate their route choices, cutting off escape paths before they could be fully utilized. "He knows this territory," Aiyana observed during a brief rest beside a mountain stream. "Either he's hunted here before or someone's providing him with detailed maps." Thomas studied the compass readings, comparing their position to landmarks his father had taught him to recognize. The old man had been a surveyor before becoming a rancher, his expertise in navigation passed down through stories and practical instruction that proved invaluable in current circumstances. "There's a pass about 10 miles north," Thomas said, tracing their potential route with his finger. "It's dangerous this time of year, but it leads down into territory that's officially Apache land. Even Winters might hesitate to follow us there." "Apache land offers no safety for me," Aiyana replied quietly. "My people will not welcome a woman who chose exile to help white settlers, and they certainly won't protect a white child from territorial authorities." The reminder stung because it highlighted the impossible position they'd created for themselves. Flight from Winters meant entering territory where other dangers waited, but remaining in settled areas meant inevitable capture by someone who possessed resources and determination that exceeded their ability to evade indefinitely. Elizabeth had remained silent throughout their conversation, but her attention to every word suggested understanding beyond her years. When Thomas looked down at her, she pointed toward the high peaks with the same certainty she'd shown when directing them toward her destroyed home. "Up there," she said, speaking only her second complete sentence since regaining her voice. "Safe up there." Thomas followed her gesture to a particularly forbidding section of mountainside where snow-covered cliffs and narrow ledges created natural fortress walls. The route she indicated would require abandoning their horse and traveling on foot through terrain that challenged experienced mountaineers, let alone a small child and aging adults. But Elizabeth's perception had proven accurate in other circumstances. Her ability to sense danger and safety seemed to operate through channels that transcended ordinary observation, the same gift Sarah had possessed but refined by trauma into something approaching supernatural awareness. She sees something we don't, Aiyana agreed, studying the child's face with professional attention. Children who survive impossible circumstances often develop enhanced intuition about threats and refuges. The decision to attempt the high mountain route meant accepting risks that could kill them as surely as winter's bullets, but it also offered their only chance of reaching territory where pursuit might become impossible. Professional trackers excelled in familiar environments. Extreme wilderness tested survival skills that few bounty hunters possessed. Thomas secured the compass in his shirt pocket and began redistributing their supplies for foot travel. Essential items only: food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies. Everything else would be abandoned, including the horse that had carried them faithfully but couldn't navigate the narrow ledges and steep climbs ahead. As they prepared for the ascent, distant movement caught Thomas's attention. Winters and his men had appeared on a ridge less than 2 miles behind them, their pursuit relentless despite the increasing difficulty of terrain. The bounty hunter had somehow anticipated their route once again, positioning his team to cut off retreat while driving them toward the mountains. "They're herding us," Thomas realized grimly. "Winters wants us to attempt the high passes. He thinks the mountains will do his killing for him." Elizabeth tugged at his sleeve, pointing toward a different route that angled away from the obvious path toward steeper but more concealed approaches to the high country. Her alternative suggestion led through terrain that appeared impossible for anyone to survive, but might offer concealment that would break Winter's tracking advantage. "Trust her," Aiyana said simply. "She has guided us truly so far." The sacred eagle feather Aiyana had carried for 23 years became the catalyst for Thomas's spiritual awakening. She placed it in his hands during their 3rd night in the mountains, when exhaustion and fear had stripped away his civilized defenses against truths he'd spent years avoiding. "Your daughter speaks to you through this child," Aiyana said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to interpret messages from the spirit world. "Sarah's love didn't end with her death. It found a way to reach you when you needed healing most." Thomas held the feather with reverence, understanding that he was receiving something sacred from a culture that had every reason to distrust his people. The gift represented more than personal gesture. It was spiritual adoption, recognition of transformation that had begun the moment he'd chosen to protect Elizabeth rather than seek his own safety. The mountains had changed him in ways that seemed impossible after only a few weeks. The soft rancher who had lost his family and abandoned his responsibilities had been replaced by someone harder, more focused, driven by purpose that transcended personal comfort or security. Elizabeth's presence had awakened protective instincts he'd thought died with Sarah, while Aiyana's wisdom had shown him paths toward healing he'd never imagined possible. "Papa Thomas," Elizabeth said that night, using the name she'd chosen to honor both her lost father and her found protector. The designation felt natural, right in ways that formal adoption papers could never accomplish. She had begun speaking more freely as their journey progressed, her vocabulary expanding as trauma gradually released its grip on her voice. But her words carried weight beyond their years, insights that demonstrated the enhanced perception Aiyana insisted came through surviving impossible circumstances. "Mama Catherine taught me to read the sky," Elizabeth continued, pointing toward stars that blazed with unusual clarity in the thin mountain air. "She said people we love become lights that guide us when we're lost." Thomas followed her gaze, seeing constellations that seemed arranged in patterns of meaning, rather than random stellar distribution. For the first time since Sarah's death, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that love might survive physical separation, that the bonds forged between parents and children could transcend the grave's apparent finality. "Your mama was wise," Thomas replied, his arm tightening around Elizabeth's small form. "Maybe she and Sarah are working together now, making sure we find each other when we needed it most."
Aiyana had begun preparing Thomas for the spiritual ceremony she insisted was necessary before they could complete their journey safely. Her traditions required recognition of the transformation he'd undergone, acknowledgement of his acceptance of responsibilities that went beyond protecting one child to embracing his role as bridge between cultures that had been enemies.
"You carry Anglo and Apache wisdom now," she explained, arranging items for the ritual. "Elizabeth needs both kinds of strength if she's to survive in a world that will try to force her to choose between heritage and belonging." The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Aiyana painted symbols on Thomas's forehead, using clay mixed with water from their mountain stream, each mark representing qualities he would need for the trials ahead. Courage for facing superior enemies, wisdom for making impossible choices, strength for enduring losses that might come. Elizabeth participated with solemn attention, her small hands helping to arrange the sacred items Aiyana had carried through years of exile. Her involvement transformed the ritual from something foreign into family blessing, creating bonds that felt more permanent than legal documents or social conventions. "Now you are truly her father," Aiyana pronounced when the ceremony concluded. "Not through blood alone, but through choice and commitment and spiritual recognition of what the Great Spirit intended." Thomas felt the truth of her words settling into his bones like warmth from their small fire. The guilt and grief that had driven him into wilderness had been replaced by purpose that gave meaning to each day's struggles. Elizabeth needed him to be more than the broken man who had lost everything. She needed him to become someone worthy of the trust she'd placed in his protection. "And what are you to us?" Thomas asked Aiyana, understanding that their strange family unit required acknowledgement of her central role. "I am the bridge," she replied simply. "The one who brings healing to wounds that seemed permanent, who shows paths toward hope when darkness seems complete." Elizabeth moved between them, taking their hands and joining them in a circle around the fire. At 5 years old, she understood family connections that transcended conventional relationships, bonds forged through shared survival and mutual dependence rather than simple biological inheritance. "We're safe here," she announced, with the certainty that had guided them through impossible terrain. "The bad men can't find us in this place." The silver cross hanging from Aiyana's neck had remained hidden beneath her medicine bundle for 23 years, a secret that could have meant death if discovered by either Apache traditionalists or white settlers who viewed her as an enemy. Now faced with Thomas's growing love and Elizabeth's need for complete truth, she finally revealed the artifact that explained her complex heritage and tragic past. "My father was Father Miguel Santos, a Franciscan missionary who came to our village when I was 12, Aiyana confessed, her weathered fingers tracing the cross's intricate surface. "My mother was Nailnish, a respected medicine woman who believed healing came from understanding all paths to the Great Spirit." Thomas studied the cross, noting its quality craftsmanship and religious significance. The revelation explained Aiyana's fluent English, her knowledge of white customs, and her willingness to help settlers despite tribal opposition. She was literally caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, but understanding both with intimate familiarity. "Father Santos was not like other missionaries," Aiyana continued. "He learned our language, respected our traditions, sought to find common ground between Christian teachings and Apache wisdom. My mother taught him about healing plants, while he taught her about his God's mercy." Elizabeth listened with the rapt attention she always showed when adults shared important truths. Her small hands touched the cross gently, as if recognizing another artifact that connected past to present through love and loss. "What happened to them?" Thomas asked, though Aiyana's expression already suggested tragedy. "The territorial government declared all missionaries must choose between converting Indians completely or abandoning their posts. Father Santos refused to demand that our people abandon all traditional practices. He said God's love was large enough to include different ways of worship." The impossible position created by government ultimatums became clear. Father Santos faced official persecution for his moderate approach, while Aiyana's mother endured tribal suspicion for her relationship with a white missionary. Their love story played out against political forces that demanded absolute loyalty from people whose hearts recognized no such boundaries. They were killed during a cavalry raid that was supposed to target hostile Apache harboring enemy agents, Aiyana said, her voice carrying decades of carefully controlled grief. Father Santos died protecting our village's children. My mother died treating his wounds, refusing to leave his side even when escape was possible. Thomas understood that Aiyana's exile hadn't been punishment for helping white settlers, but voluntary separation to honor her parents' sacrifice, while protecting her tribe from association with mixed heritage that could bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. The cross represented more than religious faith. It symbolized the possibility of building bridges between cultures that seemed destined for eternal conflict. Father Santos and Nilanish had proven that love could transcend racial boundaries, that understanding could exist between people committed to finding common ground, despite external pressures demanding separation. This is why you knew Elizabeth needed both kinds of wisdom, Thomas realized. Your parents showed you how to honor different traditions without abandoning either completely. Elizabeth will face the same challenges I have faced, Aiyana agreed. She carries Morrison blood, but Apache knowledge, white features but Indian wisdom. The world will try to force her to choose sides, but her strength will come from refusing to divide her heart. The revelation also explained why Aiyana had risked everything to save Elizabeth. Seeing a mixed heritage child threatened by violence that targeted those who didn't fit neat categories of belonging, she'd recognized her own story playing out in different circumstances. The Morrison family massacre wasn't random frontier violence, Thomas said, understanding dawning. Someone knew about James and Catherine's friendship with local tribes, their willingness to trade and cooperate instead of demanding submission. Elizabeth's parents were building the kind of peaceful relationships that threaten people who profit from conflict, Aiyana confirmed. Their success showed other settlers that cooperation was possible, which challenged those who wanted territorial expansion through warfare rather than negotiation. Elizabeth had been listening to their conversation with growing agitation, her small face showing recognition that suggested recovered memories rather than new information. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of witnessed truth. Bad soldiers came at night, she said simply. They said Papa was Indian lover, said Mama taught Apache ways to white children. They said we had to go away so other families wouldn't learn wrong things. The child's testimony revealed the true scope of the conspiracy they faced. Elizabeth's survival threatened not just individual killers, but an entire system of territorial control that depended on maintaining racial hatred to justify continued violence and land seizure. Thomas removed his wedding ring for the first time since Martha's departure 3 years ago, the gold band sliding from his finger with surprising ease. The circular symbol of his failed marriage had become a weight that anchored him to grief and guilt, preventing the forward movement that Elizabeth and Aiyana needed from him now. He placed it carefully in his shirt pocket beside the compass, transforming it from active jewelry into cherished memory. The abandoned cavalry outpost, where Jacob Winters had finally cornered them, offered defensive advantages that might compensate for their numerical disadvantage. Built into a natural rock formation, the fort's stone walls could withstand rifle fire, while providing elevated positions for returning shots. Water from a natural spring ensured they wouldn't die of thirst during a prolonged siege. But Winters had chosen the location precisely because it offered no escape routes. The fort's defensive strength became a trap when facing enemies patient enough to wait for starvation or desperation to force surrender. The bounty hunter had demonstrated tactical brilliance by driving them toward apparent refuge that was actually perfectly designed imprisonment. He wants us alive, Thomas observed, studying Winter's positioning through gaps in the stone walls. Otherwise he'd have tried a direct assault already. Elizabeth alive,
Aiyana corrected grimly. We are complications he'll eliminate once he has the child. Thomas had spent the morning reviewing everything he knew about warfare, drawing on experiences that seemed inadequate for their current situation. His military service had been brief and decades old, consisting mainly of patrol duty that involved more boredom than combat. Ranch life had taught him to shoot accurately and think strategically about resource management, but facing professional killers required skills he'd never developed. Yet Elizabeth's presence transformed his limitations into advantages. Fighting to protect her awakened instincts that operated beyond rational calculation, the desperate creativity that emerged when conventional options had been exhausted. He found himself considering tactics that would have seemed impossibly reckless under normal circumstances. The old ammunition storage, Thomas said, pointing toward a partially collapsed section of the fort. If we could create an explosion when they advance. Dangerous, Aiyana replied, and likely to bring down walls that protect us as much as threaten them. Better than surrendering Elizabeth to people who murdered her parents. The conversation was interrupted by movement on the ridge overlooking their position. Thomas counted 4 figures, moving with professional coordination, their approach cautious but confident. Winters had waited until afternoon to begin his final assault, probably allowing time for fear and desperation to weaken their resolve. Elizabeth had been unusually quiet during their preparations, her attention focused on something beyond their immediate circumstance. She arranged small stones and patterns that become familiar during their journey. Geometric designs that seem the credits designs, that seem the repeat design. Geometric design. They're coming, Yoga Titanic. They're coming to the Titanic. They're coming, she announced, without looking up from her stoically deduction minutes. Thomas followed her gaze toward the opposite ridge, seeing nothing intentionally.
Apache, Aiyana said suddenly, her expression shifting from resignation to something approaching hope. My brother's band. They've been tracking us. The possibility seemed too fortunate to believe, but movement on the distant ridge confirmed Aiyana's identification. Apache warriors had positioned themselves to observe the confrontation, their presence changing tactical calculations in ways that might save their lives. Will they help us? Thomas asked. They'll help me, Aiyana replied carefully. My exile was voluntary, not punishment. And they have no love for white bounty hunters who operate in Apache territory without permission. Winters had apparently noticed the new arrivals as well. His team's advance halted as they reassessed a situation that had suddenly become much more complex. Fighting trapped civilians was one thing. Engaging Apache warriors on their home territory was an entirely different kind of conflict. Elizabeth stood and walked to the fort's main entrance, her small hand resting on the heavy wooden door that had been barricaded against assault. When she looked back at Thomas and Aiyana, her expression held the same certainty she'd shown when guiding them through impossible mountain terrain. Time to fight, she said simply, her child's voice carrying adult understanding of what the next hour would demand from all of them. Thomas checked his rifle one final time, ensuring every cartridge was properly seated and ready for use. Whatever happened next would determine whether Elizabeth grew up free or died with the secrets that had already cost her family their lives. The carved stone token Aiyana pressed into Elizabeth's small hands bore symbols that represented her new identity as daughter of 3 worlds, Anglo through blood, Apache through spiritual adoption, and something entirely unique through the love that had forged their unlikely family. The child clutched it with the same reverence she'd always shown her wooden doll, understanding that she was receiving something precious beyond monetary value. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously as Jacob Winters discovered that his carefully planned assault had become a trap of his own making. Apache warriors materialized from positions that should have been impossible to reach undetected, their rifle fire precise and devastating. Winter's team found themselves caught between the fort's defenders and attackers who knew every stone and shadow of their ancestral territory. Thomas fired his first shot through a gap in the stone wall, watching one of Winter's men stumble and fall. The satisfaction was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was fighting for something that mattered more than his own survival. Each pulled trigger represented justice delayed but not denied, protection for innocent life that he'd failed to provide when it mattered most. Elizabeth had positioned herself in the fort's most protected corner, but her attention remained focused on the battle's progression with supernatural intensity. Her violet-blue eyes tracked movements that Thomas couldn't see, anticipating tactical developments before they occurred. Behind the big rock, she called out, pointing toward a boulder that provided cover for one of Winter's men. "He's moving to get closer." Thomas adjusted his aim and waited. When the bounty hunter emerged from concealment exactly where Elizabeth had predicted, Thomas's shot took him center mass, eliminating the threat before it could develop into danger for their position. Aiyana had armed herself with a rifle taken from their supplies, her marksmanship proving as accurate as her medicine skills. But more importantly, she maintained communication with the Apache warriors through hand signals and bird calls that coordinated their assault with military precision. "My brother says Winters is trying to retreat toward the horses," she reported, "but they've cut off that escape route." The battle's turning point came when Winters himself appeared on the ridge overlooking the fort, his expensive rifle aimed directly at Elizabeth's position. Thomas saw the bounty hunter's intention and threw himself between the child and the threat, knowing that Winter's shot would likely be fatal regardless of interception. But Elizabeth moved with speed that seemed impossible for her small size, pulling Thomas down just as the rifle cracked. So the bullet passed through space where his head had been moments before, striking stone and showering them with rock fragments. "How did you know?" Thomas gasped, his heart pounding from the near-death experience. "Saw the shiny thing," Elizabeth replied, matter-of-factly. "Shiny things mean danger." Her enhanced perception had saved his life through observation skills that operated beyond normal human limitations. The same gift that had allowed Sarah to predict weather changes and sense adult deceptions had evolved in Elizabeth into something approaching battlefield precognition. Thomas returned fire immediately, his shot forcing Winters to seek cover, but missing the kill shot that would have ended their ordeal permanently. The bounty hunter was wounded but not eliminated, still dangerous despite the tactical collapse of his planned assault. The Apache warriors pressed their advantage with coordinated movements that demonstrated why they'd remained unconquered despite decades of military campaigns. Their knowledge of terrain and tactical flexibility made Winter's remaining men appear clumsy and predictable by comparison. Within minutes, 3 of the 4 bounty hunters lay dead or dying on the rocky ground surrounding the fort. Only Winters himself remained, wounded and trapped, but still armed and desperate. Such men became most dangerous when facing inevitable defeat, willing to take enemies with them rather than surrender to justice they'd avoided through years of careful planning. Elizabeth stood suddenly, her small frame silhouetted against the fort's entrance. Before Thomas could stop her, she walked outside into the open ground where Winters could see her clearly. "I remember you," she called out, her child's voice carrying across the battlefield with startling clarity. "You were there when they hurt my mama and papa. You told the bad soldiers what to do." Winters emerged from cover, his rifle trained on Elizabeth, but his expression showing recognition and fear rather than triumph. The child he'd hunted across hundreds of miles of wilderness had just identified him as participant in mass murder, providing testimony that could destroy his reputation and possibly his life. "You should have died with them," Winters snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Thomas's shot took him between the shoulder blades before he could complete the motion, the impact spinning him around and dropping him face first onto the rocky ground. The threat that had pursued them across the territory lay still at last, his weapon falling harmlessly beside his outstretched hand. The legal adoption papers Thomas had prepared in Silver Creek's territorial courthouse represented more than bureaucratic formality. They transformed Elizabeth Morrison from orphan survivor into legally recognized daughter, with all the protections that formal family status could provide. The documents bore official seals and witness signatures that would stand against any future challenges to their relationship. Territorial Marshal William Hayes arrived at the fort 3 days after the battle, accompanied by a federal investigator whose authority superseded local jurisdictions. The discovery of Jacob Winters' body and his associates' remains had triggered official inquiries that reached all the way to Washington, where politicians suddenly showed interest in frontier violence they'd previously ignored. "Mr. Brennan," Marshal Hayes began, his tone respectful rather than accusatory, "we need to understand exactly what happened here and why a territorial agent was found dead in Apache country." Thomas had spent those 3 days preparing his testimony, working with Aiyana to ensure their account would be both truthful and strategically presented. Elizabeth's survival depended on official recognition that she'd been the victim rather than the cause of the violence that had consumed her family. "Winters wasn't a legitimate territorial agent," Thomas replied carefully. "He was a bounty hunter, hired by whoever wanted Elizabeth Morrison dead to cover up the massacre of her family. The federal investigator, Senator James Crawford, had traveled from Denver specifically to examine evidence that suggested territorial authorities were either complicit in or incompetent to prevent systematic murder of settlers who cooperated with local tribes. Political implications extended far beyond individual crimes to questions of governance and constitutional authority. "These adoption papers appear properly executed," Crawford observed, examining Thomas's documentation. "But we need to verify Miss Morrison's identity and your legal standing to assume guardianship." Elizabeth had been coached carefully about what to say and what to omit during official questioning. Her testimony needed to establish the facts without revealing capabilities that might make her seem unreliable or potentially dangerous to adults who didn't understand her enhanced perception. "My name is Elizabeth Morrison," she stated clearly when asked to identify herself. "Papa James and Mama Catherine are dead. Papa Thomas is my family now." The simple declaration carried legal weight that surprised Thomas with its authority. Elizabeth understood that her choice to accept him as family was as important as his decision to claim her as daughter. Their bond had been formalized through shared survival rather than biological inheritance. Crawford's investigation had uncovered evidence that corroborated their account in ways that strengthened rather than challenged their credibility. Winters' personal effects included correspondence that revealed payments from sources with clear motives for eliminating witnesses to the Morrison family massacre. "We've identified the parties responsible for funding Mr. Winters' activities," Crawford announced. "Several territorial officials and business leaders who profited from conflicts between settlers and local tribes. They viewed families like the Morrisons as threats to their financial interests." The revelation vindicated Thomas's suspicions while providing Elizabeth with official recognition as victim rather than fugitive. Her survival had exposed corruption that reached into territorial government, making her testimony valuable to federal authorities seeking to clean house in frontier administration. Aiyana's role in the events required more delicate handling, given the political sensitivity of Apache involvement in what could be portrayed as frontier violence. But Crawford proved surprisingly enlightened about the complexity of territorial relationships and the value of cooperation over conflict. Miss Aiyana's actions saved a child's life and exposed criminal conspiracy, he stated for the official record. Her cooperation with this investigation demonstrates the kind of relationship we should be building with tribal leaders rather than the adversarial approach that has characterized past policy. The legal proceedings also addressed practical questions about Elizabeth's future care and education. Thomas's financial resources were modest but adequate, his character references solid despite his recent years of wandering. More importantly, Elizabeth's clear preference for remaining with him carried significant weight in judicial decisions about child welfare. The court recognizes Thomas Brennan as legal guardian and adoptive father of Elizabeth Morrison, Crawford announced after reviewing all evidence and testimony. These adoption papers will be filed with territorial and federal authorities to ensure their validity across all jurisdictions. Elizabeth smiled for the first time since the battle, her small hand finding Thomas's larger one with the confidence of someone who had finally found permanent security. The legal recognition meant that no future challenges could separate them based on questionable authority or manufactured accusations. "Are we really family now?" Elizabeth asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "We've been family since the moment we chose each other," Thomas replied. "Now everybody else knows it too." The wedding vows, written in 3 languages, created a ceremony that honored all the traditions that had shaped their unlikely family. Thomas spoke his promises in English, the formal language of his upbringing and legal identity. Aiyana responded in Apache, her words carrying spiritual weight that transcended mere legal contract. Elizabeth, as their witness and blessing, repeated key phrases in Spanish that Father Santos had taught Aiyana decades ago, completing a circle of cultural understanding. 6 months had passed since the battle at the abandoned fort, time that had allowed their small family to establish roots in the healing canyon, where their story began. Thomas had used his remaining resources to purchase the land legally, ensuring that no future territorial disputes could threaten the sanctuary they'd created together. The homestead they'd built reflected their merged heritage in every detail. The main cabin followed traditional Anglo construction methods, but incorporated Apache design elements that improved ventilation and natural lighting. Gardens planted by Aiyana grew both European vegetables and native medicinal plants, creating abundance that served practical and spiritual needs. Elizabeth had thrived during their months of stability, her trauma gradually healing under the care of 2 adults who understood different aspects of her complex identity. She spoke English with Thomas during formal lessons, Apache with Aiyana during spiritual instruction, and had begun creating her own mixture of both languages that felt natural to her developing sense of self. "Papa Thomas," Elizabeth said on the morning of the wedding, "will Mama Aiyana be my real mama now?" The question demonstrated her understanding that family relationships could be chosen and formalized rather than simply inherited through biology. At 6 years old, she grasped concepts that many adults struggle to accept about the nature of belonging and identity. "She's been your real mama since she saved your life," Thomas replied. "Today we're just making it official, so everyone knows we belong together." The ceremony itself took place beside the stream where Aiyana had first found Elizabeth, the location chosen for its spiritual significance rather than conventional convenience. Marshal Hayes had agreed to perform the legal portion of the service, his presence ensuring that their marriage would be recognized by territorial and federal authorities. Aiyana wore her finest traditional dress, decorated with patterns that told stories of healing and protection. Thomas had purchased new clothes for the occasion, but chose simple designs that showed respect for the solemnity of their commitment, without attempting to compete with Aiyana's cultural regalia. Elizabeth served as both flower girl and ring bearer, her responsibilities taken seriously despite her young age. She had helped create flower arrangements using plants that grew naturally in their canyon, each bloom chosen for symbolic meaning that Aiyana had taught her to recognize.
The Apache portion of the ceremony included rituals that connected their family to spiritual forces that governed the land itself. Aiyana and Thomas shared sacred tobacco while speaking vows that acknowledged their responsibility to protect not just each other, but the harmony between human needs and natural balance. I promise to honor your wisdom while sharing my strength, Thomas said, his words carefully prepared with Aiyana's guidance. I promise to protect our daughter while learning from her gifts. I promise to build bridges between our peoples while respecting the boundaries that preserve what makes each culture valuable. Aiyana's response carried the weight of prophecy fulfilled rather than hope expressed. I promise to heal your wounded heart while you protect our growing family. I promise to teach our daughter the old ways while you prepare her for the new worlds she must navigate.
I promise to love you with the same devotion I give to the Great Spirit's will. Elizabeth presented the rings with ceremony that matched the adult's solemnity, understanding that she was participating in something that would define her future security and identity. The simple gold bands represented permanence in a world that had shown her how quickly everything familiar could disappear. The Spanish portion of the ceremony honored Father Santos's memory and Aiyana's mixed heritage, acknowledging the complexity of identity that Elizabeth would inherit. The words spoke of love that transcended racial boundaries and understanding that grew stronger through difference rather than weaker. When Marshal Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, Elizabeth cheered with the pure joy of someone who had finally found the family stability she'd lost during that terrible night when soldiers destroyed her first home. Her applause echoed off the canyon walls like celebration shared by the spirits of all those who had loved and protected her. Their first dance as a married couple took place around the fire, where Thomas had first heard those impossible words. She has your daughter's eyes. Now those eyes belong to their daughter, watching her parents with love that encompassed gratitude, hope, and the unshakable confidence of someone who knew she was finally permanently safe. The silver locket that had belonged to Sarah found its way into Elizabeth's hands on a crisp autumn morning 2 years after the wedding, when the child had grown confident enough in her new family's permanence to ask questions about the sister she'd never met, but somehow always known existed. Thomas had ridden with Elizabeth to the small cemetery outside Silver Creek, where Sarah's body rested beneath a headstone he'd been unable to visit since her funeral 4 years ago. The journey represented completion of a circle that began with grief and ended with acceptance, carried by love that had multiplied rather than diminished through sharing. "Tell me about Sister Sarah," Elizabeth said, her 7-year-old voice carrying the reverence she reserved for matters of spiritual importance. Aiyana had taught her that death was transition rather than ending, that love created bonds stronger than physical separation. Thomas knelt beside Sarah's grave, his weathered hands tracing letters carved in stone that spelled out a name he'd been afraid to speak aloud for so long. Sarah was curious about everything, just like you. She asked questions that made adults think harder about things they thought they already understood. Elizabeth placed wildflowers on the grave, with careful attention to arrangement, creating patterns that honored both Sarah's memory and Apache traditions about honoring those who had crossed over to the spirit world. Her small hands worked with the same precision she brought to all important tasks. "Mama Aiyana says Sarah sent her dreams about finding me," Elizabeth continued. "Says sisters take care of each other, even when they live in different worlds." The concept no longer seemed impossible to Thomas, who had learned to accept mysteries that transcended rational explanation. Sarah's unusual perception, Elizabeth's enhanced intuition, the impossible coincidences that had brought them together, all suggested spiritual connections that operated beyond physical limitations. Thomas opened the locket carefully, revealing the daguerreotype portrait that had sustained him through years of wandering. Sarah's serious expression gazed out from the silver frame, her violet blue eyes holding wisdom that seemed to approve of everything that had transpired since her death. "Sarah would have loved you," Thomas said, placing the locket's chain around Elizabeth's neck. You both see things others miss, understand truths that adults sometimes forget. Maybe that's why the spirits made sure you found each other through me." Elizabeth studied the portrait with intense concentration, her expression showing recognition rather than mere curiosity. "She looks like the girl in my dreams," she said quietly. "The one who shows me safe places when I'm scared." The revelation didn't surprise Thomas anymore. Elizabeth's connection to Sarah seemed to operate through channels that had nothing to do with physical meeting or shared experience. Perhaps love created its own pathways between souls that needed each other, regardless of circumstances that seemed to make such connections impossible. "Will you take care of this for her?" Thomas asked, indicating the locket. "Always," Elizabeth promised with the solemnity she brought to all sacred commitments. "Sarah and me are both your daughters now. We'll take care of each other, and you and Mama Aiyana forever." The walk back to their horses took them through Silver Creek's main street, past the rebuilt shops and homes that demonstrated frontier resilience in the face of tragedy and loss. The town had healed from the violence that claimed Elizabeth's birth family, but memories remained in the careful way neighbors watched over each other's children. Elizabeth waved to Mrs. Henderson, whose own daughter had become Elizabeth's closest friend during their occasional visits to town. The friendship had developed naturally despite their different backgrounds, proving that children possessed wisdom about acceptance that adults often struggled to match. "Papa Thomas," Elizabeth said as they mounted their horses for the ride home, "I want to learn to read better so I can write letters to Sarah. Mama Aiyana says if I write them and put them in special places, Sarah will know what I want to tell her." The request demonstrated Elizabeth's understanding that relationships could continue beyond physical presence, that love found ways to bridge any separation when nurtured with attention and care. Her spiritual sophistication had grown under Aiyana's guidance, while retaining the innocent faith that made such beliefs natural rather than forced. As they rode toward home, where Aiyana waited with dinner and stories, and the quiet security of family bonds, forged through choice rather than accident, Thomas felt the last traces of his old grief transforming into gratitude for everything that had been lost and found and carefully protected. The locket caught sunlight as Elizabeth rode beside him, Sarah's image visible through the clear glass that separated past from present, while connecting both through love that had learned to multiply rather than diminish, through sharing with hearts large enough to honor all the children who had made him a father.